Hello and welcome to AWS Supports You. I'm your host, Mike Wells, a Senior Technical Account Manager based out of Boulder, Colorado. Joining me today is Naeem Asghar and Vamsi Yanamadala from AWS Support. Naeem, can you give us a quick introduction?
Thanks, Mike. Hey, everyone. So I'm live from the UK. It's kind of raining here. So I'm Naeem Asghar. I'm an SAP solution architect. I work with our partners across, the global system integrators. Some of my roles are, discussing some of our AWS services and architecture best patterns when it comes to SAP workloads on AWS.
Thank you. Vamsi?
Yep. So I am Vamsi. I'm also an SAP Partner Solution Architect. I'm based in Dallas, Texas, and I focus similarly to Naeem on really working with our large GSI partners and really around adopting SAP on AWS and helping their customers in turn migrate and get the most out of running their SAP environment here.
Thank you to you both for that great introduction, and thank you so much for joining us to talk to us today about securing our SAP environments. Before we get into the details, a quick note to the attendees online. Please use the chat to let us know where you're joining us from. We'd really love to hear from you to know where in the world we're getting viewership from. We'd also love to know if you're using SAP, and feel free to ask any questions throughout the episode. And please, I'm going to post a link in the chat for our survey to let us know what you think of the show, give us some ideas of what we can do to be able to give you guys some things going forward and know what you'd like to talk about next. Vamsi, can you walk us through what we're going to be talking about today?
Yeah, sure. As the title says, it's, how to best secure your SAP environments on AWS. But what that really means is SAP is a, mission critical, business critical application that, customers run financials, all of their back office business processes on. And so it's really critical to ensure that that data is kept secured. And one interesting study came out, and nearly 65% of the Forbes 500 list have experienced some sort of security incident in the last 2 years around SAP. And another thing that's even more interesting and really tied to the financials is, to remediate and take SAP offline ends up costing, somewhere around like $4.5 million per incident. So it is very important to secure your SAP environment, and we'll be kind of diving into a lot of, I would say, a lot of topics today. We're going to cover a lot of ground. So first, we'll be doing a live lightboarding session, and we'll kind of cover all things around multi-account architecture and strategies there, VPC layouts, and really those common core security functions that are available on AWS. So things like network access control lists, security groups, subnetting. We'll kind of dive into all of that, as well as securing your inbound, outbound communication. And then we're actually going to do something a little more exciting on the second half, where we're going to talk about securing your SAP data, and talk about a really unique use case where we're starting to see customers really leverage with AppFlow. So we can jump right into really the network basics, and get started.
Brilliant. Thank you guys for that. So what we're going to do is we're going to start to build this architecture out step by step, so you understand, what's going on, and we'll explain each of the security aspects that you can actually employ from a best practices perspective. So let's get started. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to drop a region in. So you see that my regions just appeared on screen. And then I'm going to start deploying workloads. And you can see these workloads are being deployed in an AWS account within a VPC across 2 availability zones. So let's start labeling these. So this will be my shared VPC or shared account for shared services. So we're just going to call it shared right here. Hopefully you guys can see that nice and clearly. So shared for things like auditing, logging, your on-prem connectivity is probably coming into shared as well. So we're going to focus on that as well as we go through this session. But is there anything else you want to add to that, Vamsi?
Yeah. Yeah. So in addition to even some of the auditing and security things, what we also find is sometimes SAP Solution Manager, which is a centralized system,
Good point.
oftentimes is deployed and shared. Things like for administrators, jump servers or bastion hosts are also going to be deployed there, and even EFS. So for those
Yeah.
shared file systems like your SAP transport directory and things like that can oftentimes be also kind of all housed and shared in that shared services account.
Brilliant, brilliant. So now we've got our shared services account and our shared VPC. So let's actually drop in the second one, and this is going to be production. So this is prod, and I'm just going to put prod right here. So for production, for business critical workloads, so security is absolutely paramount, especially for production workloads. And we'll discuss some of the different things you can do as we go along. And we'll come back to prod in a minute when we start to break down some of the key things that you can do, as Vamsi kind of summarized at the start. And from the third perspective, we have our non-production environment. So we're talking about QA, dev, potentially sandbox. So although we've got a simplified deployment here of 3 accounts and 3 VPCs, in essence, you would have an account for QA, you would have one for dev. But for now, we're just going to call this non-prod. So that just to summarize that from that perspective. Now, when we talk about multi-account deployments, there's a couple of key points that need to come into play. The first one is network isolation. So, Ramsey, over to you. You want to just start talking about that?
Yeah. So when we start talking about network isolation, we're going to define our VPC. In this case, we have our prod VPC, and within SAP is typically the application and the database are always deployed in that private subnet. And we really secure them through a couple of different ways. One, at the subnet level, we will additionally add network ACLs to secure those subnets. And then at the instance level, we will also define security groups, opening only the right protocols that are needed for SAP communication.
Yeah, and those security groups are like virtual firewalls that you can actually apply to each of these instances or a group of instances. And as you can see, I've highlighted the network access control list. I've just circled that. So that's at the subnet level, and those security groups can operate at the instance level. And in fact, they can actually span across AZs as well.
Yep.
Now, so
yeah,
I was just going to actually, go for it.
I was going to say one more thing. Since we're talking about networking and network isolation, one thing that really comes into play also is when you talk about multiple VPCs and the like, is leveraging VPC flow logs. And that will help you monitor the inbound, outbound communication that's coming into that VPC and into those SAP systems, and then leveraging something like guard duty where you're able to kind of immediately start not just collecting and monitoring, but really analyzing that network traffic and pattern.
Brilliant. So VPC separation is super important from that perspective. So just a summary, we can actually control the traffic that's coming into our production account using network access control lists, using security groups, and monitor it using, by monitoring the VPC flow logs with AWS data, with AWS
Guard duty.
Guard duty. There you go. I keep always forgetting that. I always say data guard, which is the opposite. But what about when we want to look at user isolation or actually controlling who has access to production? How do we go about doing that?
So that's, and that's really important, right? Because you want to keep your production environment, and especially administrators that can come in and do work on systems really to the smallest group or the ones that really must have access. So because we're deployed in multiple AWS accounts, we will have IAM, and we can leverage IAM in a couple of different ways. So, for example, in our prod, we're going to lock that down. Folks like maybe developers and the like will not have any edit or ability to really modify anything in production. And just the administrators. But then in non-prod, let's say we have a sandbox VPC. they can start experimenting. They can start applying code. They can also maybe even leverage native services to build a code pipeline. They can do quite a bit more where they can experiment. And so IAM will allow us to control those differently in each of the accounts.
Exactly. So it's super important that the developers get that flexibility to experiment, innovate, and then again, it's super important that we have production, secure from a user perspective and from a networking perspective. But what about when we started to talk about data isolation?
Yeah. So, data isolation is an interesting topic, right? Because we do have scenarios where we will have backups. For example,
Yeah,
system refreshes are very common, where your test QA environment needs to have a similar data set as well as all the configuration that's in production. Typically, we see that with SAP customers. At a minimum, maybe it's once a quarter that we need to refresh that data.
yeah,
And by default, since we're again deployed across multiple VPCs and multiple AWS accounts, those backups, those AMIs that we take of our production systems are not explicitly shared. So you can think of like if we have our AMI backups, we basically have to select and share that to our non-prod account. Again, kind of giving another layer of security.
exactly. Yeah. No, very good point. So that's again, the three key points are network isolation. We're talking about user control and user isolation to a specific extent, and then that data isolation. So those are some of the key benefits, and you'll see some links at the end, that we'll share with you at the end of these sessions that you can actually go in and actually look at other benefits of having a multi-account deployment like you see on screen at the moment.
Yep.
Just real quick, in case you're just tuning in, we're discussing how to secure your SAP workloads on AWS. Just a shout out from the audience. They really love the lightboard setup. I just wanted to let you guys know that it's really everyone thinks it's super cool. So thanks a lot for sharing.
Appreciate
Yeah.
it.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Awesome. So I know, Naeem, we talked about those key ways of isolation, right? But obviously we also need to have cross communication, and especially to shared. What are some ways, what is kind of our best practice around setting up the communication between these VPCs?
So that's a good question. I remember when at the start I was talking about shared, and I was saying that your on-prem connectivity is probably coming into shared first. That way you have that kind of single account where you can actually manage the traffic coming into your overall AWS environment. So you can deploy VPC pairing between the different VPCs, but when you look at this kind of multi-account deployment where you're going to have tens of accounts, maybe even hundreds of accounts, VPC pairing for each explicit connection is not going to be enough. And from an overhead perspective, in terms of managing that operationally, it's going to get real complicated. So one of the things that we can use to mitigate that, or a service, is the AWS Transit Gateway. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw it into shared and then start to connect up these VPCs. So we'll drop in the Transit Gateway right here. Kind of a circle there. There you go. This is what happens when you're live. So this is our transit gateway. This is going to be our focal point for connectivity coming from on-prem into our AWS environment. Next, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to connect up the VPCs. So we're already in shared. So the transit gateway is connected to shared because it's deployed within that account. Then what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to connect it to prod and non-prod. And obviously, if there are other connections, other VPCs and other accounts, we will connect the transit gateway to those as well. So the first thing I'm going to do is just draw a line here, hopefully nice and straight into prod, and then a second one straight into non-prod. Now, as I said, with the transit gateway, you would actually deploy an attachment per connection, and it just simplifies everything. It's that one focal point where you can actually control the connectivity. You can actually manage it from a single route table.
Yep. So then, Naeem, I know, some scenarios, right? Folks may be wondering why you're going to set up, like, is there scenarios where prod needs to talk to non-prod or non-prod to prod. And, I think with SAP, one of the interesting things are you do set up some what they call, RFC connections or backend connections where you need to do code comparison and things like that, where that
Exactly.
dev system or Q test system may need to, at least run a function and compare code against production. So
Exactly.
this transit gateway and setting up the single route table and doing the administration in one place really simplifies this
Yeah.
setup.
And it meets that operational excellence, requirement in terms of just being able to manage these systems in an automated way, in a more controlled way.
Yep. So now, great, we got we have our SAP environment. It's all kind of plumbed up to where now it can talk to itself and all of the shared services. But let's say from an end user aspect, right? We have a customer data center or coming in. How would we set that up so end users can actually start accessing the SAP system?
So again, this is a common requirement for any SAP workload deployed on AWS. It's that external connectivity to your on-premise sites for your users, for example. So the first thing I'm going to do is actually draw out just a building to simulate on-prem. So let's do that. Right here, we're going to draw in a little tower, a little side building to go with it, right? Nice and easy. So this is our on-prem site outside of the AWS region. So you can see the AWS region is just within here, and we're going to draw that in like this. Now, connecting your on-prem site to AWS, there's two options available to you essentially. So the first one is you would have a direct connection straight in. So we're going to just draw that in. So this is a dedicated secure line dedicated just for you. And you can actually provision this using AWS service providers, depending on the region and the location that you're on-prems in. The second option is, and sometimes customers, what they'll do is they'll have a direct connect and they'll also have a VPN. And the VPN tends to be, that backup connection, or you may have two VPNs. And in some cases, some customers may have two direct. It really depends on the customer requirements. But those are the two options in terms of connectivity from on-prem into your AWS and connected to your, again, that really useful service around the transit gateway.
And we have a quick question from the audience. JibJab06 would like to know if there are any specific requirements for SAP support.
Yeah, so that's actually a really good question. I think, we'll actually cover that right after we cover this user connectivity. We'll talk about SAP support and how do you set that up securely. So actually, that's a very good question for the next topic.
Yeah,
thanks.
And before we jump onto that, just want to actually point out again, when we're connecting from on-prem to AWS, we're talking about encryption in transit. So this is where IPsec will come into play across your direct connect. So direct connect, although it's giving you the connectivity, you still need to secure that. So that's where IPsec will come into play. And with VPN, you would get IPsec as your security, as your encryption in transit as well.
So yeah, I mean, let's jump to that question, Naeem. We have now we have end users. We have our SAP environment secured on AWS. Let's say we need to reach out to SAP support and they need to come into one of these systems, right? We have an SAP router that'll be deployed in that shared services. And that'll be kind of that central entry point, right?
Exactly. So as always, we try to control the access coming into AWS to ensure that you have the correct security setup, like the IPsec, and our instances are wrapped in security groups and so on. And the same applies when we're allowing SAP support to access the AWS environment to provide support on your SAP deployments running on AWS. So we have our SAP router. So let me just draw the SAP router. And the actual SAP router, again, will be deployed within a security group, just like the database, that was just an example that we were giving you. So let's wrap that in a security group. And again, the rules here would be only allow access to SAP support, okay? And you would actually define that in the actual rules for that security group.
Yeah. And in addition, right, if we have our SAP support again outside of the AWS environment, we would leverage, registering that SAP router and setting up SAP Secure Network Connection (SNC), and really ensure that we're providing, only kind of the right connectivity only to SAP support and no one else. So it's really a combination of SNC, security groups, network ACLs, really securing that SAP router from any outside interference.
Brilliant, brilliant. So, are there any questions that we can cover? Wow, any other questions from the group?
I have a question. Where does the SAP Web Dispatcher go in this whole scenario?
Okay.
Yeah, so that's a really good question as well, right? So, really when we start looking at any web application protocol, so HTTPS type protocols where SAP is providing that application access, we'll have potentially a web dispatcher, and what I would say typically deploy is our application stack in we'll just draw it out in AZ2 since there's a little bit of room there.
Yeah.
So that'll be our SAP app server, and that may be one or many app servers, to be honest, and
Exactly.
that
Yeah.
will be in front of that will be our web dispatcher.
So just within the same private subnet, right, Vamsi?
Yep.
So this would be our web dispatcher, and then after that.
Yep. So then we'll put in an ALB, an application load balancer.
Brilliant. See if I can remember the icon for that. That's the thing, you need to know every single icon that we do. So we call this the ALB, right?
Yep.
Oh,
And then I would say that's basically where the traffic will be. Exactly. Yep. So that'll front the traffic from a web dispatcher and which is fronting all of the SAP applications, and then that will then be routed through the transit gateway and then onto the customer data center. And then if there are some scenarios where you may have like third-party vendors, right, where they're outside of your enterprise that may need to log in and get in, and in those scenarios, we always suggest things like using a web application firewall, AWS WAF, as well as AWS Shield to be able to really secure that external connectivity, and also kind of protect yourself from DDoS attacks.
yeah.
And again, that would be really, if you need to externally make something available from an SAP application login.
Great.
There you go.
I feel like I sort of needed to know where it fit, and now I have a whole architecture. That was a great answer. Thanks a lot.
It's the best part of doing this live is we're able to kind of fill this out.
Exactly.
So I'd say there's one more thing that I think we touched a little bit on, Naeem, and it maybe goes actually to the earlier question is, requirements for SAP support, right? There are a couple of things when it comes to SAP support also coming in to look at the systems. One is a data provider, right? There's an actual SAP data provider that should be installed on all of your EC2 instances that run the SAP application. So, again, it's maybe hard to draw out, but if you draw, it's really part of.
I just put the name in so the users know that this is a requirement that you must have on each EC2 instance. I just put the name in so everyone has a point of reference instead of drawing it in on each EC2 instance, which will get a bit messy. So carry on, Vamsi.
Yep. No, and I would say that's one thing that we find that can sometimes be overlooked on especially large scale deployments, but it is something, especially called out in SAP support, and it gives them visibility into, the underlying hypervisor and all of the EC2 metrics for support to be able to diagnose any performance type issue, especially.
Yeah. And There is a SAP note associated with that as being a requirement. In addition to that, things like detailed monitoring needs to be enabled on your EC2 instances as well from SAP Supports perspective for data provider to actually do its work.
So yeah, I would say, just to kind of summarize, and are there any questions, Chris? I guess before we
I don't see any currently.
Okay.
None from the audience right now. Yeah.
Okay, no worries. Yeah, so I'd say to really summarize, this is kind of just a walkthrough of really all of the best practices around deploying your SAP environment on AWS. So when we really kind of build this all up, we can, we're talking about multiple accounts and multiple VPCs as a standard practice, and really having production and the production VPC and accounts more secured with IAM around user isolation, having the network isolation through network ACLs, security groups, and also monitoring that interconnectivity between all of your VPCs through VPC flow logs. We also talked a little bit about data isolation with things like AMIs and backups. And then we also covered the whole inbound, outbound communication to on-prem, as well as how SAP support would come in and help you kind of troubleshoot any issues you may be having. So in a nutshell, that's really a big part of our networking and kind of really setting up your SAP environment on AWS. And we'll cover a couple of other things. Was there a question, Nick?
Yeah, quick question. Charishiel one wants to know, is the data stored within AWS or is it stored outside of AWS?
So in this example, all data is really stored within AWS, right? So it would be the systems have migrated onto AWS, and these are kind of the best practices in securing it. Now, there may be scenarios where for other reporting purposes, there may be data going back to your on-prem data center for further analytics, or they could be going into other environments and native services through AWS as well. So we'll actually cover a little bit of the data movement, but I think to answer the question, in this example that we covered, all the data, SAP data resides on AWS.
Yeah,
great. Thanks.
All right, so Naeem, I know we're next, we're going to be looking at some, really around securing that SAP HANA data itself, right?
Yeah. And so if we so this is kind of like round 2 now. So you've just seen me reset the board. Basically, that means rubbing everything out live. And now what we're going to start talking about is we talked about things like encryption in transit as we were discussing some of the connectivities and so on. But let's start looking at things like encryption at rest, and we'll start doing that around the HANA system. So again, I'm going to drop the AWS region in. You can see it's in a VPC, and I've even deployed a subnet to help me, to save me having to draw it out manually. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually start drawing a HANA EC2 instance in, and then we'll start to build out the architecture step by step with Vamsi's help and the team's help. Okay, so first things first, let's draw an EC2 instance in, and we're going to call this our HANA database. And then what you're going to see me do as I do this is, let me just give it a label. So HANA. Now, when you're deploying your HANA systems on AWS, obviously you could be using high memory instances, but your storage configuration is super important in terms of how you lay that configuration out. So, and there's a specific AWS guide which directs you in terms of ensuring you're getting the right performance. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add the volumes for each of for logs, HANA data and HANA logs. So let's do that. And we'll just do that here. We'll draw this in. Switch to green. Hopefully you guys can all see that. And then we'll draw in another 2 sets of volumes, and these will be our HANA logs. So I'll draw them in, I'll write them in for you as well.
Hey, while Naeem's drawing that, is there is this a bring your own license model? Does it apply to SAP similar to Oracle or
Yeah, so the way SAP licenses, so there is a kind of a perpetual license that is that bring your own license model. So you would be able to bring all of these. There is actually a very important SAP note that provides all the interoperability of versions on AWS. So if you were running a legacy version, for example, there's some specific restrictions, but I would say it is very much you bring your own license model. In terms of is it similar to Oracle? That's interesting because with Oracle and especially around SAP systems running Oracle, you have to kind of convert your OS licenses to Oracle Enterprise Linux. In this scenario with SAP, if you're running HANA or you're running other SAP version of database such as Sybase ASC, you would be able to use any of the supported OSs like SUSE Enterprise Linux or Red Hat.
Great, thank you very much for that, and thank you very much, AWS Guy 4034, for that question. Just a sort of words of encouragement. Thank you very much from Amaraz, who says, "Great work, guys. Really clear and easy to understand." So
Awesome.
I think that
We appreciate the feedback. Yeah.
Yeah.
So Ramsey, I've drawn in the volumes. So these are EBS volumes. Now for HANA, you can use GP3, you can use IO2 if you need a more performant disk. But the question I have for you, Ramsey, is how do we go about looking at encryption at rest when it comes to our HANA data and HANA logs?
Yeah. So no, that's a very good question, and I think the going in standard is to always use EBS encryption. There's a couple of ways to, with the click of a button, you can really encrypt those EBS volumes that make up your data and log directories. There is, there are some advantages with that because, as far as performance, you're not really taking a performance hit because it's kind of built into EBS. But as an alternate option, or even as a second layer, if you have really strict governance around your data encryption, customers may leverage HANA native encryption. So that would be at the database engine level. So you would face some, performance hit at that EC2 instance that's running that HANA database. But again, both of those options are available with EBS encryption, definitely as an easy standard to implement.
Brilliant. And then, so we've got our EBS volumes, we've got them encrypted. So Ramsey's obviously highlight two options. What about things like backups and so on? So as a standard practice, we will always recommend your HANA backups will be going to S3. And we have specific services and tooling to support that. So the AWS backend agent is required. So you would actually install the agent right here on your HANA EC2 instance. And then you would have your S3 bucket. Let's just say it's deployed right here, just outside. So we're going to draw a kind of large bucket. We'll give it a name. So this is our S3 bucket. So our backups are now going into this S3 bucket. And the other thing to point out is the AWS backend agent actually integrates, so you can actually manage it from the SAP HANA cockpit and so on. So you can actually control that, manage that, set up your repeat schedules or backups and so on. The question I have here is okay, so we've got S3, we've got HANA sitting within our subnet, within our VPC. How do we get the data to the S3 bucket without going outside of AWS and ensuring that we have a level of security in place?
So we would create a VPC endpoint, right, using a gateway endpoint in particular to kind of be where the S3 is kind of that termination point. And so that'll be, right in between your HANA. So your HANA backup flows out and passes through and securely gets moved into that S3 bucket. And that's in, a really a good way to ensure your security is set up. As well as one other thing I would say with the backend agent name that we should cover is there are IAM roles that are required for backend. So we would set up a IAM role with the S3 permissions so that that instance is able to reach into that bucket and place those backups.
So just remember, everyone, that for the HANA EC2 instance to even write to that S3 bucket, it needs to have those permissions to be actually be able to modify the bucket, store stuff on the bucket, retrieve stuff from the bucket. So without the IAM role in place, you won't get access to the S3 bucket. So it's a super important aspect of this actual configuration as well.
Yep. And so, another topic to look at is, since we are storing all of those backups in S3, we have to worry about encryption there as well, right, Naeem? So what are some things that we offer out of the box?
So when it comes to, so we've obviously covered IAM roles, we've talked about gateway endpoints to ensure that our backups are not going out of AWS and then coming back into the S3 bucket. But again, from a security perspective, what about encryption at rest from an S3 perspective? So with S3, there's a number of options, and I'm going to list you out some of the most important ones. The first one is allow S3 to manage the encryption keys and encrypt your backups and data for you. So that would be SSE S3, and you can look this up. And I know, Vamsi, we've got some links shared.
Yeah.
We'll have some links for this as well, right?
Exactly.
And then you've got SSE KMS. So that means your actual key for your encryption is managed by our own KMS service, or key management service. And then you have SSEC, which means that your key is actually managed by the customer. So yourselves, you would manage the key, and then the server-side encryption would do the work. But the other point to mention here is you can have completely customer-managed keys on the client side to secure your S3 data and encrypt it. So again, with AWS, there are a number of options. Each customer has their own needs, but you have the option of using any one of these in addition to just completely managing the encryption client side.
Great. So I think, we have one more, now that we have backups covered and, kind of every way to store kind of your data at rest and securely also with backups. There's one more scenario I'd like to cover, which is kind of what we're seeing customers start to do more and more now, which is being able to extract SAP data and really combine that data to build something like an operational data lake, or have more dashboarding or better insights that are driven with a combination of data, right? SAP is a part of it, and the one thing that is common in this is that we're seeing more customers leverage Amazon AppFlow, and specifically the SAP OData connector that was, I believe it was released sometime last year, or maybe the year before. So, so we have our application tier. So the one nice thing with AppFlow is it will connect to the SAP application layer. We're not extracting data from the database using any kind of ODBC type connection. This will be actually with the business logic that as it's going through your application tier. But when we start looking at this, doing this securely, there's a couple of best practices, and we'll start to kind of draw this out, right, Naeem? So, first we have our network load balancer. So we will set that up as the front of our application servers. And then, and then we will also have to establish a private link endpoint that will, again, kind of go to the right of that NLB, right?
Yeah, so let me just draw that in for you. So this is our, just repeat that for me, Vamsi. Thank you.
Yep, this is our private link endpoint.
Yep. And again, this is bi-directional, so just bear that in mind. So we've got private link.
Yep, and then
just explained. Yep.
And then we'll define also an interface endpoint that'll sit right between that private link and the app flow. service. And so all of this is now securely where AppFlow can trigger a job or trigger a schedule of jobs, and we'll go through this secure private link and in through the load balancer, log into your SAP application. And there's a couple of things actually when it comes to login. So we can use things like secrets manager if we're statically putting in a username password. We can also set up OAuth so that it is much more secure going to log into your SAP application. But again, the connection's also secure as we're going through this private link and then on into your SAP application. So that's great. We've got our kind of our ingestion part of this, right? But then, we need to put this data somewhere. So again, we would kind of follow the same, process that we did with our backup solution below. We would set up typically another gateway endpoint and a secure connection to S3. Just for simplicity, though, we'll kind of just draw it as a direct link between AppFlow and S3.
Yeah. So there is a kind of a repeat of this section that would go here, but from a simplicity perspective, as Vamsi's saying, we're just going to do a direct connection, but there would be an additional private link and an interface endpoint to help secure the connection from AppFlow to S3 as well.
Yep. And the one thing that you called out that was very interesting also, Naeem, is this is bi-directional. So not only is AppFlow able to extract data, but if through further analytics or we're running, some forecasting model, for example, it can also push data into SAP that can be provide, again, more valuable data back into the SAP system.
Absolutely.
What other applications does AppFlow connect into? And sorry if I'm hogging the floor. If anyone wants to ask another question, please do so in the chat. But
that's a really good question, because I mean, AppFlow is got. I think there's new connectors, being developed quite so frequently, right? So, what some of the ones that I'm aware of is there is a Salesforce connector. That's one that I think with SAP we find interesting, because not only do you have your manufacturing and kind of operational data in SAP, but now you have your sales data. So you can really start to drive more insights by tying those two systems and those data sets together.
Wow, that seems powerful.
Yep. And one more, one more thing that's kind of a newer capability or release from AppFlow is, S3 was the only target, but I think we're starting to see that, Redshift and being able to run, really advanced analytics through Redshift is another advanced capability, and something we're starting to see a lot of excitement with customers.
Great. That JibJab6 just asked that question. If there were any other output, if AppFlow can output to any other destinations in S3, so that's good to know. We have another question from Security Live. Any Splunk integrations, and or maybe just we should ask centralized logging in general.
Yeah. So let me check. I'm not sure about Splunk, but I know that there's quite a few around. I know Datadog is on there on the list. Yeah, I can. We can probably put that product page link right with all the connectors, because there, like I said,
Right.
there's probably 30 plus connectors right now that are available.
Right, we can grab that and throw that in the chat. And one last question: can AppFlow put data to an SQL database as a target?
So if we're saying, I think as a source, as an SAP system, right now we would need to develop something where there would be an ingestion from S3 then into SQL. That is something that I think, as working with the product team, if there's a reason, or if there's a compelling case, happy to bring that up. So would love to explore that more. But as of right now, today, I think S3 and Redshift are the targets for specifically the OData connector.
Okay.
And just bear in mind that when your data gets to S3, you can use Amazon Athena to query it, for example, using like a SQL-based query, for example, to actually start querying the data once it's in S3. So there are a few options in that kind of scenario as well, just to keep in mind.
All right, so I know, Naeem, we've covered quite a bit of ground even on this.
Yeah.
Are there any other questions, Mike, before we kind of maybe wrap up?
I'll put that to the chat. We have Naeem and Vami for just a few more moments. Does anyone have any more questions in the chat? I don't think so. I think we're good, but I'll let them trickle in a little bit. I'll interrupt you if we have anything else come in.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah. So again, I think it's very hard to cover all security elements in 40-45 minutes. So the one thing that we do want to make sure everyone also is aware of is there is a well-architected framework SAP lens, and that as with all of our pillars, security is one of those key pillars in that well-architected framework. And you'll find really a lot of all of our collection of best practices that are updated frequently in that SAP lens. So we'll also provide a link to that, and there you can again kind of dive a little bit deeper into things like we didn't get a chance to talk about key rotations and some of these other best practices, but all of that is really covered in the well-architected framework SAP lens.
And just to point out as well, that well-architected framework with the SAP lens is super important because it will highlight all of those key areas from a security perspective. Obviously, there's a number of pillars when we're talking about the well-architected framework. So it will help you optimize from cost, from an operational perspective. Obviously, today we're focusing on security. So make sure you check out the link that you will get alongside this video and have a look and have a read of that. It's super important that any workloads you deploy in AWS that you do a well-architected review with the SAP lens to ensure that you're following AWS best practices and security best practices as well.
Fantastic. Well, thank you both so much. As you all know, today we looked at securing your SAP workloads on AWS. If there are any questions that were not answered today, you can post your questions on repost.aws, where some of our experts can provide you with answers to your questions and could possibly become a topic of one of our next shows. If you have feedback for us, please check the chat box on the right for a link to our survey. Or you can email us at awssupportsyou@amazon.com. We want to hear from you. Tell us what else you'd like to see on the show. And also, please join us on 3/27 at 2 p.m. Eastern, that's 11 a.m. Pacific, for an answering your repost questions on security. This is where we take questions that come from the forum and answer them live for you. Thank you so much for joining us at AWS Supports You, and happy cloud computing. And thank you so much to our guests.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Mike. Thanks, everyone.